Hi everyone, and welcome to today's program with Lord Robert Skidelsky, Professor Emeritus of Political Economy and author of the prize-winning three-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes, and of course a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. So welcome back to the program, sir.
Thank you for asking me again.
So I was very intrigued by a recent article of yours. In the nation. There's Russophobia, an epidemic disease. And the argument, I guess, is that one can be suspicious and be prepared to react to security threats from Russia without descending into the irrational. And again, what I thought was interesting as well, that this is hardly a new argument. If you, as you suggested, if you go back 200 years, in 1836. This was the argument of John Stuart Mill. And the same year, actually, in 1836, you also had Richard Cobden, who published this pamphlet. He called it The Cure for Russophobia. And a
Right.
century later, you had the excellent book by John House Gleason on the genesis of Russophobia. And now, again, a century later, again, we are yeah, I think it's a case can be made that the fear and hatred of Russia cannot solely be explained by the rational, and yeah, it also has bad implications for our security. So, uh, what is Russophobia, and well, what is the core of your argument?
Well, I mean, I think the essence of Russophobia is an irrational fear of Russia. It's partly because it's so big, and therefore it seems like a giant, giant octopus wanting to sort of spread itself everywhere. But it's also, I think, it was ideological. I think at the root of it was the idea that, well, was an autocracy, and autocracies are expansionist. That is a simple, very simplistic argument, and therefore it was always going to be expansionist. Then, of course, you had, and so that went on through the 19th century: Tsarist autocracy, barbaric Russia, the scourge of democratic Europe. All those sort of themes continued. Then, of course, you had that went on in the Cold War. It was institutionalized in the NATO alliance. Russia was about to, unless it was stopped, about to hurl itself against democratic Western Europe. And then there was the thaw of the 1990s. And then it seemed that Russia was about to join the civilized world, as it was called. And then again, it's recurred in the last 10 years. I think really it started in the early 2010s, and then there was Crimea, and then there was Ukraine. And now it's all back with all the old tropes, exactly the same, unchanged. And that's where we are now. But you need to know some of the history of it, because the point is, of course, great powers have conflicts of interest. We know that, and they're often negotiable, provided you haven't got a phobia about them, which is a phobia is irrational. A phobia is a psychological term, and I think this applies in this case. And it's very dangerous because it means you can't talk to people. If you have a phobia, you've got to either get rid of them somehow. In human terms, either they go to a mental institution, or you, in great power, in national terms, you get rid of the regime which embodies the evil intentions. I think it's as simple as that.
No, I think the non-negotiable aspect is quite important because it does feel that that's where the concerns of mine at least come in. That a lot of the conflicts we do have with the Russians, there are solutions, but if we believe that again, it is this incompatibility that again it does appear what's where ideology comes in. You said
I
it's
know
all.
you're right. I mean, in the last 10 years, there's been no negotiation with Russia at all about their differences. I mean, you had sanctions and escalating sanctions, and then silence. There's been no contact between our government and the American government and the Russians for 10 years until Trump came. And whatever one says about Trump, and there are lots of bad things you can say about Trump, he actually believes in active diplomacy. And active diplomacy is the only chance of getting making an end to the Ukraine war in reasonable time. Otherwise, it goes on, and there'll be more and more bloodshed. And I think the thing about Trump, he says repeatedly, and this is where I think he is genuine. He says, "Let's stop the killing. In order to stop the killing, you have to start talking to the Russians." And he's the first one in 10 years in the NATO camp that's been prepared to do so.
Well, I guess it appeals to a very deep instinct in human nature because, they always say that human beings are, social beings who organize in groups, us and them, and we tend often to assign the opposite values to our opponents. So finding different, I guess, place cards for good versus evil. Because with the Russians, if you go back in the centuries, it was typical to portray again us as the Europeans, while they were the Asiatics, we were the civilized, they were the barbaric. I guess during the Cold War, it took on a more of a ideological framework. So it was again, everything was capitalism versus communism, or
Yeah.
but after the Cold War, we really recast this again, this centuries-old contrast of
The tools were available for use. You
yeah,
have a mixture of the ideology, you have the domestic utility of creating an enemy. And then you have, of course, the great power competition. So it all adds up to a Molotov cocktail, really. I should say, just with reference to NATO, the Russians had their version of Westophobia, you could call it NATO-phobia, in the Cold War, which is that I think Stalin generally believed that the Americans wanted a war against communism, that they were aggressive. And so Russia portrayed the NATO countries also as inherently aggressive because they were capitalist, and capitalists had to fight communists. So there was a dual phobia going on, but the Russophobia was more deeply rooted because it was rooted in the history of the relations between Russia and Western Europe for, as you said, since the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And now I think we have a chance again of talking to them. And that was the chance created by the new president. We're promised, I don't know whether it'll happen, we're promised the start of negotiations in Ankara, or Istanbul, I should say, maybe in 2 or 3 days. And I hope they'll succeed. But Russophobia is very, very deep.
well, no, I agree. I think, of course, you find the same on the other side. I think now the us versus them view in the yeah in Russia, they often focus now on the West's moral cultural
Yeah,
decadence and
NATO expansionism.
yeah.
You see, the story isn't clear cut. It's not one lot are good and the other lot are bad. I mean, of course, NATO expansionists. I mean, we say, look, this is simply an excuse by Putin for a progressive action and to restore the old Russian Empire. And they've certainly always, since the 1990s, regarded NATO as an expansionist force, a dagger aimed at the heart of Russia. And any opportunity to plunge the dagger in will be taken. I mean, that has been, I think, the official Russian view. And there's a bit of phobia about that. It's not entirely phobia, because there is this moral crusade on the part of the West to dismantle these autocratic structures. Tony Blair in 1997, no, sorry, well, what am I talking about? In 2003, I think, made this famous speech in Chicago in which he said, "The spread of our values makes us safer." And that was the ground of what is called liberal interventionism. We intervene wherever we can in order to overthrow autocracies. despotisms, dictatorship, the governments that don't share our values. And if we succeed in doing that everywhere, then the world will be safe and there'll be peace. Peace will reign eternal, which is a ludicrous idea because there are always going to be clashes of interest. And that's the consequence of not having a world government. We live in an anarchic situation and we have to talk to each other and in order to keep the peace. And that's such an obvious thing to me that to sort of approach these issues in moral terms, as though we are the only people who have a moral sense of what's right and the others have to be somehow got rid of, is a recipe for perpetual war.
Well, I guess it's this Kantian promise of perpetual peace, which gives justification or motivations for perpetual war, which is what we've seen.
Absolutely.
But I like,
Absolutely.
but I like the term you used, moral crusade, because I think we see some of the similarities as we saw during the Crimean War. Because Gleason in 1950 he wrote about this that with the conflict between the Russians and Ottomans, that everyone had to be assigned a role. So the Russians then were the aggressor, the Ottomans were the victim, even though until then the Ottomans had been seen as being very aggressive and essentially being the bad guy in the relationship with the Greek, but nonetheless they were the victim. And then, of course, the British and the French would play the role of the savior, suggesting that the role were altruistic, only seeking, so you remove all the strategic competition and you just assign this good versus evil role. And I thought this is interesting because we do this to the same extent with Ukraine as well. That is, Russia is the aggressor, so it's unprovoked. Ukraine is the victim; they didn't do anything, and of course, the NATO countries are the savior. So it's we're third party, just standing on the sideline, just helping. We're not. It's
Yeah,
not
just
our
have,
war in any way. So it
and
is.
and it's become not NATO, but the coalition of the willing, as it's some NATO countries are not so keen to play this particular game. But going back to the Crimea, there are two elements there, I think, which are worth mentioning. First of all, it was part of what in 19th diplomats called the Great Game between Britain and Russia. Britain wanted to, it had established its own empire in India, and so it wanted to protect India against Russian incursions into the East Asia and also the Suez Canal. So that was the excuse for propping up the decaying Ottoman Empire had to be preserved because otherwise Russia would get Constantinople or Istanbul and then would have an access to the Mediterranean and that would threaten British communication. So that was one aspect of the Great Game. So the other aspect, which is new, is that Russia was not sanctioned in the Crimean War. And we have a new weapon with which to express our moral repugnance, and that is economic sanctions. It's interesting, Russia actually raised a loan in London during the Crimean War because there was then a separation between politics and economics, whereas now we use economics as a weapon. It's a blockade. I mean, sanctions are an economic blockade. They're a weapon of war. And of course, they're particularly suitable to our times because you don't actually want to fight. And so we think we can do it this way. We can degrade the Russian ability to wage war by imposing more and more sanctions on them. And I notice now that the coalition of the willing are also calling for more sanctions if Russia doesn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire. So you see, these ideas continue.
Well, the ceasefire doesn't make much sense, though. Really, I mean, if it's if you look at the prospect of well for the Russians that if the fighting ends, the whole necessity for the Ukrainians and the Europeans to accept the concessions would go away. But I want to ask because why do you think there was such a great proclivity among the British for this Russophobia? Again, it's also been the case across Europe. Indeed, one can argue that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that I guess the mantle of Russophobia was handed from the British, not from the French to the British. But why do you see Britain being, having yeah, I guess being at least one of the front runners in this.
Well, you see, I think one of the reasons is historical reflex, or I should say imperial reflex. So they can be the junior partner of the United States and endlessly pushing the United States in that direction. And there, I mean, so I think imperial nostalgia plays an enormous part in this. In this sense, we can once more, as British, assert ourselves on the world stage in a world important at a world important moment, at a historic moment. So I think these historical reflexes are very important. I mean, the other reason I think is moral. I mean, British foreign policy has always had this moral sort of bit to it. And that was, I mean, the French called it la perfidie anglaise, Anglican perfidy or hypocrisy, you might say. And people will beat the moral drum without in any way understanding that their own actions were far from moral. I mean, for example, they talk about this endless Russian expansion at the same time as the British Empire was expanding. But our expansion was good because we were bringing the light to the lesser breeds, as it was called then. Whereas their expansion was bad because they were expanding barbarism, despotism, autocracy, and so on. So, in those two ways, the historical imperial reflex and the moral reflex, I would say, probably explain most of why the British have taken the lead in Russophobia. Their Russophobia has been stronger than even the American because there's been no alternative opinion in Britain. You cannot get any contrary view given any kind of credibility in our country.
I guess this is a problem of, well, the dark side of trying to pursue a moral policy. That is, if you view the world as morality versus immorality, or good versus evil, then you can do the exact, as you said, the exact same act, like invade a country or build an empire. But if you interpret through the lens of building civilization or building a brutal authoritarian empire, then the two acts can't be comparable anymore in
There's
today.
another factor, which is Britain isn't any longer a great power, and therefore it doesn't have to deal with Russia on equal terms. Therefore, its morality can spread unchecked. America, in the 19th century, when Britain was one of the great powers of the world, and in many people's opinions, the greatest, it had to deal with Russia at various points. And so there was an element of pragmatism that kept in it was in the 19th century. In fact, there was there was an alternation between Russophobia and pragmatic deals. Because they were equal, so to speak. Now Britain hasn't got any force to use really, and therefore moralism, imperial nostalgia, there's no check on it. There's no reality check any longer because Britain isn't part of the great game, whereas America is part of the great game. And therefore, in America, there was bound to be, I think, a realization that you've got to find some way of dealing with Russia, and of course, that'll also come China.
What do you see as being the impact of Russophobia on domestic politics? Because, well, now we often focus on the Russia Gate, which aimed to bring down Trump, but in Britain, the first Labour government was brought down in was 1924. There was fabricated links between the Russians and the Labour Party with this letter of Zinoviev, I think, the head of
That's
the
right.
Communist
Yeah.
International. He argued that the Communist Party of Britain that they should engage in all this subversive activities to undermine Britain. And again, this brought down again, it's fake, but nonetheless brought down the Labour government. How do you see, I guess, linking domestic opponents to a very demonized or Russia impacts the domestic politics? Is it does it have any other, I guess, history behind it?
Yes, as John Stuart Mill said in 1836, he said, Russophobia is an excuse for military spending. Same again today. As soon as you can get a national security narrative going, then all the fiscal rules, you don't have to keep them any longer. At the moment, governments have been constrained in their military expenditure or their overall expenditure by fiscal rules, the idea that you must balance budgets, the idea that debt should be a declining percentage of GDP. All of this is orthodoxy. It's economic orthodoxy. It's grounded in economic theory, I'd say post Keynesian economic theory, and governments feel very constrained by this. They want to spend, but then they have these fiscal rules that tell them they've got to balance the budget. Now, as soon as you say national security is at stake, the fiscal rules are loosened because everyone agrees that you've got to spend in order to protect yourself, protect the nation. The fiscal rules go out of the window. You can borrow as much as you need in order to build up your armed forces. And so what I think this scenario leads to is what I call military Keynesianism, spending for defense rather than for hospitals, schools, and such like transport. You spend for defense, and then the Conservatives are very happy with this. They all agree that you must, have a very strong defense. It's very interesting. It started in Europe, hasn't it? The EU, I think, has already loosened its fiscal rules, and Germany has cut its break. It's, I think, what it's called. It's debt break or something. So they're beginning to rearm. And the real I'd say the real warriors say it's not enough to go from 2.3% to 5% of GDP. You've got to go to 2.5. You've got to go 5%, even more. So it justifies rearmament, just as the Cold War justified the continuation of very high military expenditures. So we're easing back towards high military expenditures again, and on exactly the same grounds. The Russian menace. There's the Chinese menace added to that as well. And what do they share, Russia and China? They're both autocracies.
Well, I think George Kennan, the architect of the containment policies during the Cold War, he would agree with John Stuart Mill because he also wrote in the end of the 1980s that if the Soviet Union would well sink into the ocean, then the American military-industrial complex would have to invent another adversary to, otherwise it would become, he framed it as a unacceptable shock to the American economy. So it's this continuous, well, again, it's a common theme throughout the Cold War, the threat
I agree
inflation.
with George Kennan, who also said that the expansion of NATO was the greatest mistake that you could make. And he was the architect of containment. But obviously, in his old age, he said, look, this is no longer Soviet Russia. You've got to have a new security system for Europe, which includes the new Russia and makes it possible for the new Russia to live in security with its neighbors. So he was very against that. Of course, you see, on the other hand, it's also true that the states that were freed from communism wanted to join NATO. And so it wasn't as though NATO expanded against their wishes. They all wanted security from Russia, just as Russia wanted security from NATO. So there was this clash there. And exactly in that clash, diplomacy should have had its chance. And there should have been a real settlement, which would have had some chance of lasting. But the opportunity was missed.
Well, beyond the rearmament, and again, what Germany especially is doing now, I think fits very well under the concept of military Keynesianism. And so beyond the rearmament and of course the lack of diplomacy, how else do you see Russophobia impacting the conflict now between the West and Russia to the extent it undermines our own national security?
Yeah, because it exactly, and what's more, it divides the world into hostile blocks. It undermines one of the key principles of neoliberalism as it developed in the 1990s, and that is globalization. As soon as you regard one set of people as inherently wicked, or not so much wicked as inherently your enemies, then you can't trade with them. I mean, you can't have normal relations with them, and therefore you get a terrible regression of the world towards the 1930s, when you had protectionism everywhere, when the world economy broke up essentially. And now this is what's going on at the moment, because economic sanctions reinforces that enormously. You can't do business with these countries because their aims are malign. They're called malign actors, and that applies not only to conventional weapons of war, but also cyber warfare and hacking and all these other things by which the malign countries can try to distort your own politics, degrade your own politics for their malign purposes. So you get that attitude. And I'm afraid also, I mean, in Britain, I mean, I've sat through so many debates on this, and the military lobby is very, very strong. General after general, admiral after admiral, and ex have got up and said, we must rearm against the new enemy, and that means we must spend more money. And that means government must put its procurements in our direction, throw money in our direction, not as, I don't know, a more liberal-minded person might say, to improve the public services.
There also seems to be a tendency to to interlink what shouldn't be linked. For example, a lot of the problems with Russophobia, well, often a common argument is much of it's linked to the fake testament of Peter the Great that is in the 1797 or 78. A Polish general, he gave the French foreign ministry a fake testament of Peter the Great, effectively saying that the role of Russia should be to continuous war and expansion, always push into Europe. The main purpose of the testament was to convince the French that that Polish security in the tensions it had with Russia was intrinsically linked to that security of the French. So. Again, it sounds very familiar, but the French, they brought up this fake testament when they invaded Russia, well, under Napoleon in 1812. It was used again when the French and British invaded Crimea in 53. Hitler referred to it, even Harry Truman referred to it. And well, it's not referred to anymore, but because well, it's proven to be a fake. But nonetheless, we still say the same thing that uh, Ukraine, if Ukraine falls, NATO will be next, and they will come after us. But only a year or two ago, we used to say that Ukraine had to be a part of NATO because Russia would never dare to attack NATO. So we have these
Yeah.
narratives which do not conform in any way.
Well, consistency is the hallmark of small minds, as someone said, and certainly it's very rare in politics. But there is another element in it which you just touched on, which is the what I'd say the emigre lobbies. I think in the 19th century, London filled up. Well, I mean, London was the main point of emigre Poles, Hungarians, and they were a powerful lobby, anti-Russian lobby, in the capital of the empire, which was sort of almost the capital of the world. And today, I think we have the same thing. They're Ukrainian. I mean, the Ukrainian influence on American foreign policy, I think, starts with the end of the Second World War, because the Ukrainians fought, I mean, elements of Ukraine fought on the side of the Germans. And so when the war ended, this anti-Soviet Ukrainian um, uh, uh, people, a lot of them went to Washington and were a powerful anti-Soviet lobby and a powerful reinforcement of the Cold War mentality. Now you have Ukrainians, of course, they've emigrated, a lot of them, again, to Western Europe, to the United States. And again, their voice is feeds into the way the West thinks about its foreign policy. There is no Russian. I mean, there are Russian emigres. There are emigres from Russia, anti-Putin people, but they're far smaller in number, and so they don't counterbalance the Russophobic lobbies. So that's another element I think you have to bring into consideration to explain the strength of the Russophobia.
Yeah, some also link this explanation further back to the origin of the Cold War, because after the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of the White Russian fled westwards, also, yeah, United States, and this affected. And once you had this huge change, you seek out the experts, the locals, and all the locals were the ones who fled, who had fought the Bolsheviks. So of course, it led to the construction of yeah, narratives and stereotypes which weren't very favorable. And I think beyond um, the people who fled, you also see now, I think, this idea across the EU, like how did we end up with Kaja Kallas representing the European Union foreign policy? But the general idea was, they got it right all along. They knew Russia was a threat, so let's just hand the car keys over to them, and they know what to do. But now we, yeah, have this very wild policies where she openly speaks
And
about destroying
yes,
Russia. And yeah.
and for small countries who maybe feel themselves fairly, vulnerable, very vulnerable to Russia, it's also important to be part of a bigger game, and so they can transfer their fears onto a larger stage. And that's why someone like that can become Secretary General of NATO, or you get these positions in the Western Alliance. Small countries have leaders who want to be part of a larger game, and that's why there are many of these leaders of the, I don't know, the Baltic states and so on, like to be part of NATO. It gives them protection and it gives them a bigger role. So that's I think feeds into Russophobia.
We have that in this country too, an obsession for a small country, 5 million, to play a large role, punch above our weight. This is the hallmark of our political class, I think. But
Yeah, well, and it was a small. I mean, the European Union was also partly a creation of small countries. The earliest fathers of the European Union came from countries like Belgium, Holland.
well, thank you so much for your time. I hope to get you back on in soon, as it's always great to speak with you. So thanks
Thank
again.
you. Well, thank you very much for asking me. It was a pleasure.